The observance of the Passover holiday not only marks the beginning of spring, it is a celebration remembering God's liberation of the Israelites from slavery in Egypt. Passover, Pesach, begins with Seder. The Seder is a highly symbolic because of the kinds of foods used to help tell the story. The sensations of one's experience of the palate through the evening meal not only enhances the nuances in the retelling of the Exodus, it connects each participant seated around the table personally with centuries of Jewish ancestors all the way back to the newly freed Israelites who were commanded by God to remember their deliverance from Egypt. In every generation, each person is obligated to regard themselves as if they have left Egypt. It is because of this what God did for me when I went out of Egypt. And this is also an opportunity for each person to consider being freed from their own personal Mitzrayim, their own Egypt, things to which they might be enslaved today, such as a habit or an action or a personal situation. Now, a meal, at least for me, can be a story in and of itself. The Seder meal, however, would be as bland as an unseasoned sauce if you did not understand the story behind it. So perhaps before we explore this meal, we should rewind just a bit and start with a story. At the end of Genesis, Joseph has brought his family to Egypt. Over many, many centuries, Joseph's descendants became so numerous, the reigning Pharaoh at the time, in fear of the Hebrews rising up against the Egyptians, decides to enslave them. Tradition tells us that the Hebrew slaves were the ancestors of modern-day Jews. Even in their enslavement, the Hebrews continue to have many, many children, and this prompts a decree by Pharaoh that all firstborn male children are to be killed. Enter the story of Moses, saved by being placed in a basket by his mother and set afloat down the river, only to be found and then raised by none other than Pharaoh's own daughter, God's subtle way of keeping his hand in the story. After Moses is raised as a prince in Pharaoh's court, we have a short story insert of him committing a murder, fleeing the scene, and essentially entering the witness protection program of the time, tending sheep. It is here where Moses meets God in the wilderness. God calls Moses to become the one to lead the Hebrew people out of slavery and into freedom. What unfolds here follows with more intrigue and suspense than any television drama series writer could ever hope to dream up. Moses goes to Pharaoh and tells him to release the Hebrews from their bondage. Pharaoh refuses. So God sends 10 plagues on Egypt. Of note here, though, is that none of these plagues affect any of the Hebrews. All water and rivers turn to blood, making the water unusable. Then frogs swarm the land. Lice infest all of the homes. Wild animals wreak havoc and destruction over all of the land and in people's houses. Pestilence destroys the livestock. An epidemic of boils infects the Egyptian people. Hail rains down and destroys most of the crops, and then swarms of locusts show up and eat whatever wasn't destroyed by the preceding hail. The entire land of Egypt goes very dark for 3 days, and this would have been a very, very terrifying experience. Even when we experience power outages, we still have daylight time. For Egypt, it was very, very dark. And this brings us to the 10th and final plague, when the angel of death visits the land of Egypt, killing the firstborn of every Egyptian family, including the firstborn of every Egyptian cattle. The angel would pass over the homes of the Hebrews, whose doorways, having been instructed by Moses the day before, were marked with the blood of a sacrificed lamb. Finally, after enduring God's rapid-fire pitches of plagues, Pharaoh finally releases the enslaved Hebrews. In their hasty exit, hasty as one does not dilly-dally after being granted one's freedom, they leave with only what they have. This includes their bread, which did not have a chance to rise, thus the reason for eating only unleavened bread, matzah, during this holiday. Now, hang in there. No good story is complete without a little twist. Still wanting the last word, Pharaoh changes his mind on his Freedom from Slavery Act and sends his military chasing after the newly released slaves. The Hebrews reach the Sea of Reeds, where by God's hand the waters part, and they all cross safely. The soldiers, however, do not make it all of the way and are drowned as the water crashes back over them. The Hebrews begin the next leg of their journey in search of the promised land. The story of Passover remembers this liberation from slavery to freedom and how these once enslaved Hebrews become the ancestors of the Jewish people. In Jesus' day, the Passover meals would have included meat from the lambs that had been sacrificed on the temple altar by the priests, unleavened bread, and bitter herbs. It wasn't until after the destruction of the temple, when sacrificing lambs, now no longer possible, began to morph into the motifs retelling the escape from Egypt. Many centuries of refinement and embellishment brings us to what is known today as a Seder. The Seder, celebrated in virtually every Jewish home worldwide, is steeped in ritual, story, and rich symbolism. It is both a physically and spiritually nourishing celebration. Preparation for the Seder begins weeks beforehand as homes are thoroughly cleansed from chametz, or leaven. Chametz includes anything made from the 5 major grains: wheat, rye, barley, oats, and spelt, which is hulled wheat. This house cleansing can also be symbolic of soul cleansing, that of removing any personal puffiness or arrogance or pride. Cupboards and kitchen pantries become leaven-free for Passover, which includes, for some, using a second set of utensils and dishes that have never come in contact with chametz. And the eating of any chametz is forbidden during Passover. This might sound like a very uninteresting 8-day culinary journey, but I can tell you it is quite the contrary. Seder comes from a Hebrew root word meaning order. This is the same root from which the word siddur is derived, which is the prayer book used during Shabbat worship services. There are essentially 2 sections of a Seder: the ritual and symbolic retelling of the Exodus with 4 obligatory glasses of wine, and this of course does not include what one may be casually drinking throughout the course of the meal, not bad in my book, and the actual real dinner, which can be quite lavish and may be considered the most expensive meal of the year. It would be considered the norm to invite guests, some of whom may not be Jewish. These guests may include strangers or people in need, or perhaps persons having no place to celebrate Passover. Can you hear the foundations of Christ's teaching being laid here? Can you even hear, perhaps, radical hospitality? For Seder, the order for the evening is found in the Haggadah. The Haggadah, meaning the telling, is the book or guide used for the retelling of the story. It contains instructions for the Seder, blessings, and the Passover story. Each person at the table has a Haggadah that is used to follow the 15 parts of the Seder. The Seder begins with each person pouring their first glass of wine. Kiddush, the blessing over the wine, is recited, and everyone takes a drink. Each person then ritually washes their hands. Karpas, a green vegetable symbolic of spring and usually parsley, is dipped into salt water and eaten. The salt water represents tears shed by their ancestors during the many years of enslavement. The yachatz, or breaking of the matzah, is done. There is a plate with 3 matzot, plural of matzah, on the table. There is also plenty more matzah for people to eat during the course of the Seder. The leader takes a piece from the middle of the plate and breaks it in half. The smaller piece is then placed back on the plate between the 2 other pieces. The larger broken half is called the afikomen, which becomes the fun part of the meal, at least for the children's interest, as it is now discreetly hidden to be found later during the evening. The Seder continues with the Magid, the telling of the Passover story, wherein the guests each take part in retelling the Exodus story. This part of the Seder concludes with the pouring of the second cup of wine. The story of the 10 plagues is told, and each person dips their finger in the wine, placing a single drop on their plate for each of the 10 plagues. There is a second hand washing, followed by motzi, the blessing for the matzah, and everybody eats a piece of matzah. The next symbolic food introduced is the maror, or bitter herbs, and usually horseradish, which is a reminder of the harshness of the enslavement. Everyone puts a bit of maror on a piece of matzah and eats it. Next, a Hillel sandwich is made and eaten. They place a bit of maror and haroset between 2 pieces of matzah, thus the sandwich. Haroset is a sweet mixture of nuts, apples, cinnamon, and sweet wine, and some recipes used dried fruit. It is a reminder of the mortar between bricks that the Hebrews made when they were enslaved. Now we arrive at the Shulchan Orech, the real dinner of the evening. A traditional fare might include, though not limited to, hard-boiled eggs, a symbol of life, matzo ball soup, gefilte fish, and brisket. Dinner is followed by dessert, which may include flourless honey cakes or chocolate torts, and no Passover celebration would be complete without coconut macaroons. Following the dinner, the children present at the meal, if they haven't yet fallen asleep, will be most anxious for everyone to find the afikomen hidden earlier. The tzafun, or eating of the afikomen, might be a while in coming, as the hunt may often take quite some time. A third cup of wine is poured for each guest, the blessing again recited, and everyone drinks. A fourth and final cup of wine is poured, along with a cup poured for Elijah, a prophet who delivered messages for God, and the one expected to be sent to announce the coming of the Messiah. A door of the home is open so that the prophet may enter. Hallel, which means praise, is now sung. This is the singing of songs of praise, which normally is the entirety of Psalms 113 through 118. At this point during Seder, only the last 4 are done, as the first 2 are done before the meal. The door is closed, psalmody is sung, and then everyone drinks the final cup of wine. With the Seder formally over, there still remains one final blessing to be said, L'shana haba'ah bi Yerushalayim, meaning next year in Jerusalem, in the hopes that Passover next year will be celebrated in Israel. And a traditional Seder could last between 4 and 5 hours. During this week called Holy Week, we Christians retell the story of Christ's final days, which included this feast of unleavened bread, Passover, a meal Jesus shared with his closest friends, the disciples, the night before he was handed over to the authorities to be sentenced to death by crucifixion. At the conclusion of this service, and upon exiting the sanctuary, you will find tables set with examples of some of the foods present at a Seder, with the story of God's deliverance of his chosen people from slavery to freedom fresh in your minds. Please sample the foods and engage your sense of taste, linking you to the story. Amen.